everyone. Welcome to this webinar, which is part of a series of ASI webinars on our standards revision process, and in particular, the first public consultation period, which we're currently in. I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. Today's focus is a spotlight on responsible sourcing and chain of custody. I see we've got a number of attendees online and we're expecting some more. What I'd love today is for you, it's an opportunity for you to ask lots of questions. We have a full hour for this webinar today, so lots of time. We're here to answer your questions about process and also some of the substance in the draft standards that are currently out for consultation. So please use the Q&A box that you'll find at the bottom or somewhere on your screen to ask us questions throughout. We've got lots of time for Q&A at the end as well. This webinar is being recorded and we will be sharing that broadly after the end of today as well. I'm delighted to be joined, in fact, we're delighted to see you, by Marika van der Mijn, our Director of Partnerships, and my name's Chris Bayliss, Director of Climate Change and Decarbonisation with ASI. Hi, Marika. And hello, everyone.
Hi, Chris. Thank you.
Hey, we're up to 20 people online now. I can see a kind of a focused group. As I say, lots of opportunity to ask questions. And at one stage today, I'm even going to open a poll to get some feedback from you. Now, that's not really going to be a formal part of the consultation process, but it enables us to get your thinking on some of the themes that we'll be talking about today. And those themes will be, first of all, an overview of the standards revision process and some broad structural changes you'll see in the standards, and also where we proceed from here in the consultation process. We're then going to have a deep dive on two parts of ASI's standards program. One on responsible sourcing and the points within the performance standard that responsible sourcing is referenced and how that might change between the current version 3 of the performance standard and the new draft version 4. I'm going to then spend some time on the chain of custody standard, which is also being revised. We're going to look quickly at some priority areas for input where we really need your help and your guidance in the development of these standards. And then we've got lots of time, as I say, for Q&A at the end. Before we begin, as we do at the beginning of every meeting, I'd just like to draw everyone's attention to our ASI's antitrust policy. In your Q&A and the discussion that follows, we'll be mindful of that. And if we get close to issues that start to impinge on that policy, we will stop the conversation and talk about something else. Also, I'd like to acknowledge, as part of ASI's approach to all that it does, acknowledge Indigenous peoples and their connections to their traditional lands where we and our members operate. We aim in this conversation and throughout ASI's work programme to respect the cultural heritage, customs and beliefs of all Indigenous peoples. We pay our respects to elders past and present. As I mentioned, Q&A button, please feel free to ask questions throughout. We'll try and weave the answers in to our presentations or address those at the end. So what's happening with this consultation process and the broad standards revision process within ASI? We held a couple of webinars last week on the broad changes. So if you want real deep dive on that, I'd go and check out the recordings of those overview webinars. But in brief today, to note that the scope of the standards revision process is across both the performance standard, current version 3 will become version 4, and the chain of custody standard, current version 2 will become version 3. So both of those standards are part of the revision scope, but then also supporting documents, supporting material that attached to those standards are also part of the revision scope. So things like guidance, some of the key terms, glossary terms, the assurance framework, an assurance manual that articulates how auditors assess conformance against these standards, and the claims guide, of course. The process of revision, well, as in all of ASI's work, it's multi-stakeholder. And the drafts that have been released as part of the public consultation period are the result already of around a year, slightly more than a year's work of pre-consultation drafting, reviewing, and referencing by multi-stakeholder working groups, our Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum, and importantly, ASI's Multi-Stakeholder Standards Committee, which really oversees the development of these standards and has the kind of final say on what's included, as that then passes up to the board for endorsement. So what you see today is already the result of lots of work, but there's lots of work to come. We're in the first of two public consultation periods. This one to end on the 20th of April. It's a 60-day consultation period. And we'll then have a second public consultation, again 60 days, likely early 2027, maybe slightly before. And between this first and second public consultation, these working groups, the Standards Committee, Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum, IPAF, and technical experts will take the feedback from the first public consultation and work to draft a second draft for that second public consultation, with the final standards expected to be released Q3 or Q4 in 2027. You can find more details on ASI's Standards Revision Consultation Hub. Looking at the performance standard and some of the structural changes that you will see, we're in the current version 3 of the performance standard. Really, there's this, I guess, a legacy approach to let's say kind of environment, health and safety focus, a kind of ECG focus with management systems and processes woven through criteria. And that's been a bit challenging actually in implementation, but in particular in auditing and assurance processes, where entities going through certification process need to demonstrate in multiple places to the auditor the same management systems. So repeated use of the same evidence in order to give conformance. That's both inefficient, I would say, but it also has the potential for conflict where you have the same piece of evidence in two different criteria, potentially with two different conformance ratings. And that can be frustrating for entities, and also it's very burdensome and makes the audit process quite challenging, I guess. So in this new version, version 4, which is in the draft articulated on the Consultation Hub, you'll see that we've drawn out these kind of cross-cutting sections focused on governance, management systems, responsible sourcing, and due diligence. And there, really, you will have to evidence the systems once. It's once in order to demonstrate conformance. And then underneath that, thematic sections. I guess that's more close to what we had before under criteria, focused on climate, nature, circularity, community rights, and workers' rights. And there's more kind of substantial criteria. In addition, some modular sections only applicable to certain supply chain activities or to certain points in the value chain: mine closure, bauxite residue, tailings, displacement, and resettlement. The focus today is really going to be on that cross-cutting sections piece, but we will have webinars on a number of these thematic areas. We had circularity yesterday. We've got a couple of climate ones lined up for next week as well. When you go into the performance standard, when you go into those thematic sections or into the cross-cutting sections, you'll see a kind of a reorganization, I guess, improved clarity within criteria. At the moment, we have whole criteria with subsections within those criteria that require auditors and entities to really pick apart the normative language, to really understand what pieces of key evidence are required to demonstrate conformance. And the feedback we've received over the last couple of years is that that can be, it's open for interpretation by entities and by auditors. And also interrogation of audit reports, let's say after the fact, can be a little bit confusing when you have criteria wide conformance, and it's not entirely sure, or not entirely clear, how requirements have been met. Well, in version 4, we're looking at pulling individual requirements out. So each row that you see under a criterion will be a singular requirement for which a unique piece of objective evidence will be required. Auditors will still assess conformance at the criterion level, but the requirements will all need to have been met in order for that conformance to flow through. You'll see as well any changes that you see on the right-hand side here between version 3 and version 4, so you can compare the existing criteria with those of version 4, as well as applicability per supply chain activity. One other element, we talked a lot about this last week, and it's a function of the fact that entities and our members want to demonstrate differentiated performance, is the inclusion of leading practices. And these leading practice requirements will be opt-in, they'll be voluntary by entities that want to demonstrate that they are leading practice in certain thematic areas. At the moment, we're looking at something like a 70% conformance with these in order to demonstrate or in order to make a leading practice claim. That's under consultation. So give your feedback on that approach. I won't spend much more time on this, but just to kind of note these broad changes to structure in the performance standard. And we really appreciate your feedback in the consultation, not just on substance, but also on structure and how this might be implemented in practice and audited in practice as well. The way you can engage in this consultation process, well, I encourage you to visit the consultation hub, where you will find all of the drafts of the standard and multiple ways to give us feedback, as well as links to upcoming webinars and pieces of information that will help you guide you through this consultation process. You can see the URL at the bottom of this screen, but if you go onto the ASI website, you'll find it relatively easily. How do you engage in the consultation? Well, I tell you what, we're going to be listening to you and your questions today, and we're going to take some of that information and bring it into the consultation. What we really need are your written comments. We need, in black and white, to see clearly the feedback from all of the ASI stakeholders through public consultation, and for that feedback to be able to be fed into new drafts. And in order to do that, we have to look at the weight of opinions, the weight of positions around certain options within the standard. We have to look if there are some key themes coming through. We have to look at whether there's a difference in, let's say, our civil society cohort from our upstream producer cohort, from our downstream customer cohort, and see how we can come up with negotiated outcomes between them. So really, we do need written feedback, and there are a number of ways you can do that. In fact, two key ways. One is via a survey through SurveyMonkey, where we have defined some core questions with a number of options. I'll articulate one of those today for chain of custody, where you can answer. We can take some short answers to structured questions and build that into a quantitative framework for revision. And there's also an opportunity in that SurveyMonkey survey for you to give free text comments. So it's also a way just to get your comments in black and white to us. Second approach is via an Excel feedback form, which is filterable by supply chain activity, by requirement, by a number of different elements. It allows you to focus on what you really care about and what's going to impact you. And that feedback can then be emailed back to us at consultation@aluminiumstewardship.org. Take a look at that, even if you're not going to give your comments until, later on in April. I do encourage you to go and look at these resources to think about how you're going to structure your feedback, because that well-structured feedback really enables us to easily use that in evolving the drafts. So that's a broad overview. There's lots more within there. And if you need any assistance or help with that, I'm always available. Get on the phone or send me an email if you need help plowing through all those documents. But now we're really going to get to the meat of today's session, which is drilling down into the substance and the substantial changes, and also the substantial flow through, no changes from version 3 to version 4. And with that, I'm going to pass over to Marika for this second section. Please, Marika.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris, for that introduction. And hello, everyone. So now we are going to, as Chris mentioned, talk about the responsible sourcing and due diligence requirements in the version 4 of the performance standard. But before I do that, and please go to the next slide, Chris, I wanted to start with a slide on showing you how the existing ASI performance standards, the performance standard and the chain of custody standard support responsible sourcing and due diligence. We have been receiving quite a lot of questions from our members and other people on this, and we wanted to kind of clarify this with a few points before we kind of dive into the kind of section on the new draft criteria for the responsible sourcing and due diligence part, to kind of set the scene and get a little bit of understanding on how the ASI standards help with this. So firstly, through the performance standard, when you and your tier 1 suppliers are certified against the ASI performance standard, it is assured that they are addressing, of course, critical ESG issues as identified in the performance standard. And this, of course, helps ensure that they are addressing those ESG issues, and they are, of course, this is, of course, verified through third-party verification. This, in turn, helps support you with your responsible sourcing and mitigates risks in your tier 1. So that's the first kind of area. Secondly, when you are sourcing from performance standard certified suppliers, this also supports your company's due diligence, and in particularly step 2, identify and assessing risks. It gives you through risk identification, so it gives you the confidence that your tier 1 suppliers have OECD aligned due diligence process in place as per 9.8, the criteria 9.8 in the current version 3 of the performance standards. And again, these have been assured through by third-party auditors. So this means that your performance standard certified supplier should be better positioned to give you the necessary information on risk identification and red flags, and how they are addressing key risks in their own operations and applying responsible sourcing and due diligence approaches in their own sourcing. So of course, this helps you with your risk identification. Secondly, through supply chain information. So in addition to carrying out their own due diligence, suppliers are required to share key origin information where possible. For downstream companies, this is of course back to the aluminium smelter as per criteria 9.8. And again, this helps you identify potential sourcing regions and related risks. And again, this will help inform your mitigation plan under due diligence. This supply chain information is actually going to become a more explicit requirement currently a more explicit requirement in the version 4 draft. It is already implicit in the current draft, and we'll also talk about it a bit more in detail later. And then finally, when you source, additionally, when you source ASI material, this requires suppliers to have chain of custody certification as well as performance standard certification in an unbroken chain back to the bauxite mines and scrap sourcing. You stimulate supply of an equivalent amount of bauxite, alumina, and aluminium by performance standard certified through a demand signal. Secondly, therefore, you reinforce the value of performance standards implementation by upstream companies, which creates a kind of positive cycle to address those ESG impacts and reduce supply chain risks. And finally, through sourcing ASI material, you kind of scale a broader sectoral impact, because each link in the chain back to the point of production must also be chain of custody and performance standard certified. So the demand for ASI material therefore helps to increase adoption of the chain of custody standard, and of course, in turn, again, the mandatory performance standard, driving good ESG practices upstream beyond your direct suppliers and supporting this sort of sectoral change. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that the performance standard and the chain of custody standard work kind of side by side when it comes to responsible sourcing and due diligence. Important to note, and we'll talk about this a bit later in the chain of custody section with Chris, but the chain of custody standard doesn't bring increased traceability or traceability back to the bauxite mine. That's not possible to know which bauxite mine your material comes from under the chain of custody standard, because it's not about identity preservation. We have, of course, a CoC material accounting system, and that information is not coming through that. It's the current chain of custody standard. We will talk about this in a little bit more detail later, and I just wanted to kind of make that very clear. We are looking at other ways to help companies with obtaining this information, for example, through risk mapping, but through the chain of custody standard, that's currently not. So with that and setting this scene, let's move on to the new draft requirements and the responsible sourcing and due diligence section in PS version 4. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as Chris mentioned, this is the new structure that we have. And as you have already seen, I'm sure the responsible sourcing and due diligence is a cross-cutting section similar to governance and management systems applying to all entities. This section is very important to note, applies to social and environmental risks related to the entity's supply chain. ESG impacts for the entity's own operations are covered under the thematic chapters like climate, workers' rights, etc. But this section in particular focuses on the company's supply chain and risks related to that. The focus of this webinar and my section now is also on section 3. I will briefly talk about the human rights criteria, due diligence criteria that are covered in section 1 and 2, but the focus is really section 3. So we can move to the next slide. Thank you. So what were the kind of objectives of the changes that we've made for these criteria in the standard? Well, first of all, we wanted to reduce duplication and improve the usability of these criteria. At the moment, responsible sourcing and due diligence is kind of scattered throughout the standard, and we wanted to merge these existing requirements. That's currently 2.4, responsible sourcing, and due diligence is covered under 2.9, and of course 9.8 and 9.1 into a more kind of integrated and integratable process. Secondly, as it's very important in general, the objective of our standards revision is to incorporate and further align the ASI performance standard with due diligence expectations from international standards and frameworks. And in particular, this section has been aligned with the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct and also the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. So that was an important objective for the revision. Thirdly, also, we wanted to maintain the alignment with the OECD due diligence guidance for the LME responsible sourcing rules. We are a track A aligned standard for the LME. We're currently at the very end of the OECD alignment assessment, hoping to make the decision of the announcement very soon. But we want to, of course, stay a track A standard for the LME and keep our alignment with the OECD due diligence guidance, so there will be no changes to the existing criterion 9.8 on conflict affected and high risk areas to maintain that alignment as it is. And finally, it was also from the Standards Committee very clear to make the distinction between risks related to the entity's supply chain and risks related to the entity's own operations. And therefore, we've kind of separated these sections and organized them this way to make sure that's clear. So let's move and see what the criteria actually look like if we move to the next slide. So there's a lot of text on here, but I just wanted to start showing you the new criteria for the human rights due diligence process. So that is currently covered under 2.4, so the management system section. There's a criterion on human rights due diligence, and then also the remediation part is covered under 1.3. The governance section, and there's a specific criterion on remediation of human rights impacts. So for 2.4, the big difference is that this criterion replaces the concept of social management system, which we currently have in version 3 of the performance standard. This is 2.3b at the moment, and integrates it in a broader framing of human rights due diligence in alignment with the UNGPs. So this includes assessing and mitigating risks related to labor rights for employees as well as subcontractors, as well as human rights risks for rights holders and affected communities. These are kind of minor changes from the previous criteria 2.3 and 9.1. So important to reiterate that this criterion 2.4 applies to the entity's own operations and activities. Human rights due diligence for the supply chain is covered under section 3, responsible sourcing and due diligence. Same with 1.3, so that's a specific criterion on remediation of human rights impacts. This criterion also applies to the entity's own operations and activities, and remedy for adverse human rights impacts related to the supply chain and business partners is covered under section 3.1.6, remediate where appropriate. So we'll see that in the next slide. But just to make sure that this is where human rights due diligence is now sitting within version 4 of the draft performance standard. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is the new, these are the criteria for section 3 on responsible sourcing and due diligence. So we have 4 subsections. First of all, responsible sourcing, and this is very much aligned with the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct and the 6-step framework, which of course looks at broader human rights, labor, environmental, bribery, and supply chain risks, compared to the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible mineral supply chains and their Annex 2 risks. So that is, of course, now criterion or section 3.3 that focuses on risks related to CARAs. And section 3.1 is now aligned with the OECD due diligence guidance and looking at that broader kind of supply chain risks. Then there is a section 3.2. This is a leading practice, and that looks at responsible sourcing for additionally for scrap. And then, yeah, like Chris mentioned, this is a leading practice requirements. And then finally, 3.4 is sharing supply chain information to support customer due diligence. This is a new requirement, like I mentioned, to share with customers upon their request information which can support identification and assessment of OECD guidance-related risks in the supply chain. This is already currently implicitly implied in 9.8, but we wanted to kind of highlight this and kind of make that more explicit in this draft version of the standard. And then next to the next slide. Thanks, Chris. Just to kind of before I hand it back to you, these are the kind of an overview of the key changes. I've kind of talked to this mainly already, but we have some new requirements that's under 3.1. There are more explicit requirements to incorporate due diligence and RBC expectations into policies and engagement with suppliers. So that's all new. And of course, the kind of OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct is new in this version 4 of the performance standard draft. And then, like I said, that new criterion to share information with customers is also new. And then, like I also said, and I already mentioned, is that this kind of CARA sourcing from conflict-affected high-risk areas has not changed from the current version of the performance standard. So yeah, I think I've mentioned everything, Chris. So I'll give it back to you to talk about the chain of custody standard.
Thanks very much, Marika. Before I do that, I see there's a hand raised among the attendees, Harry Alvinkel. Harry, I'm going to let you talk. So please, free to ask your question. I'm going to open that to you now. If I hear silence, I'm going to turn you off again. So get ready. And others, feel free to raise hands, ask questions throughout, or use the Q&A button. So please, Harry, over to you.
Apologies if I did that by accident. I was actually trying to write a question rather than raise my. But maybe I can take the
No
chance
worries. Well, yeah. Ask the question. Ask away.
to ask it whilst I have you. I was just interested in the focus, of course, on the link with the UNGPs, which I think is fantastic. I was also just wondering around, the connection with the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, and whether there is an argument to make that also more comprehensive of the environmental due diligence aspect. So a focus on HREDD in line with the CSDDD, and not solely on HRDD. Thinking also about nature-related risks and bauxite mining, for instance. So I don't know if you have any thoughts or
Sure
comments on that.
thing.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, Chris,
I'm not an expert in that, but please, yeah, Marika, no, go ahead, please.
No, thank you very much for that comment. I think, yeah, we've there is indeed those guidances as well. I think what we've currently done is that we've identified kind of the sort of RBC sort of risk categories, including environmental risks, social, occupational health and safety, and governance related risks in this table 1 that's kind of made explicit that environmental risks are covered, of course, under the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct. So that's how that was kind of addressed. But I think it's yeah, also something that we can potentially look into more, how to kind of make that more explicit in the current responsible sourcing and due diligence requirements.
And look, Harry, this is that your question and the implications of that have been, I guess, tossed around through implementation, even in these early days. These are the kind of the two bits. On the one hand, we hear, well, you're going to need to do that due diligence. You're going to need to look back through the chain and to understand and then manage those risks accordingly, and to use ASI's performance or chain of custody standard to gain some insight on that and to manage those risks. So that's the kind of message we get, is this movement is each step in the value chain, you are retaining the impact that is upstream. And on the other hand, we have folks who are saying, well, that's all well and good, but we know where the risks are. And ASI's performance standard is really good at defining those, let's say, mine site, gate to gate impacts and managing those risks. Let's put our money, our effort, our resources, our focus on that. So balance between information flowing through the value chain and mitigating risks for, let's say, downstream customers, and actual implications for where those risks are felt, that's a tension at the moment in the discussions, and it's kind of a tension that we want to draw out through the consultation process. So I really encourage you and others, as you have those kind of thoughts, is feed that in. Where is the balance? What is the balance between supply chain due diligence and actual focus on where those risks might lie? And how could we use that performance standard, the chain of custody standard, but also other elements to meet that? And that actually leads quite well into this next chain of custody section, is what does chain of custody do? What does chain of custody do to help you to understand those risks and also to demonstrate that they have been appropriately managed? We're doing some other work as well, potentially on supply chain risk mapping. And again, I think that will be broader than just some of the human rights related risks. I think a part of that is also carbon data and how carbon data flows in product carbon footprints through the chain in order to make claims or something else, further down. Leads well into chain of custody. Maybe my main message to you there is get that kind of feedback and that thinking into the consultation process. We really do want to hear about that, and also references to that. On the chain of custody side of things, we have been working on evolution of the chain of custody for some time now through chain of custody and claims working group, which has established that ASI's current mass balance approach or mass balance model underpinning chain of custody standard that allows for accounting, material accounting of ASI material as it passes through the chain, is the most appropriate for the new version, the version 3 of the CoC. So that mass balance approach that you've seen in versions 1 and 2 of the chain of custody is flowing through into the new chain of custody draft. Still a mass balance approach, still material accounting and allocation of ASI material to volumes of output. That was quite an interesting discussion. There's tensions there. You see parts of the value chain wanting information to pass discreetly with individual batches of material. Let's say a more identity preservation type approach. On the other hand, we see a highly commoditized supply chain, lots of mixing throughout, and what would I say? A different risk profile for the sector compared to some other metals or other materials. And really the outcome of those discussions, as I say, is that mass balance remains the most appropriate approach for CoC in order to do primarily what CoC seeks to do, which is to drive uptake of the performance standard in those areas of the supply chain which are most risky. Right, it's to say, well, there's a downstream, as Marika said, there's a downstream pull demand for ASI material that sends a signal upstream that risks need to be appropriately managed through application of the performance standard. So with that in mind, with that broad approach to mass balance, the main changes you're going to see in the draft of the chain of custody are one, streamlining. So reduced number of requirements, reduced duplication, and I'll talk a bit in a minute about what that looks like in practice. And to really strip out those elements of the standard which are not focused on material accounting. Any performance-related requirements really don't belong in a chain of custody standard. They belong in the performance standard. Chain of custody standard really being the rules for allocation and accounting for ASI material as it passes between entities or, as you'll see in a moment, some other unit of study, material accounting. As that mass balance approach has been retained, really you're going to see minimal changes to underlying accounting and allocation rules. I'm going to go through those in a moment, but I would say that the broad message here is you're not seeing something fundamentally different in terms of the rules of accounting from prior versions. I think that's an important signal to send to those entities which are currently chain of custody certified and which are seeking to retain their certification. One thing to note, though, is that while we have many entities, and I should have looked the number up, shouldn't I? I think it's probably in the 200 or so range, that have chain of custody certification. They have material accounting systems that meet the requirements of version 2. They've been assessed and assured that those systems are conformant. Of those entities, it's only a subset that actually trades in ASI material, that is actually flowing ASI material through those entities. They have certification of their systems, but you're not necessarily seeing material flow through all of those certified entities. So as we develop the new version of the standard, we have to bear in mind that there are going to be this cohort of entities which do see chain of custody certification as of value, but are not necessarily looking to flow ASI material through the system. It's interesting, and if folks are interested in some of the numbers around that, get in touch and we'll have a little explore outside of that. A third element we have, and this is very important for your feedback in the consultation process, is even as we retain that mass balance model, we're looking at how that could be evolved. So how do we ensure that even as the mass balance remains in place, that it's delivering value to those downstream that might seek some more controls or more transparency, and also meets the requirements of those upstream who are implementing these systems as well as the performance standard and want to see that pull for ASI material come through with some kind of value for them. So I'll talk about that in a moment. There are some options at play in the consultation that we really seek your feedback on. Also, I have a poll. So I will be launching a poll later on to get your first thoughts on that. No worries if you haven't explored it already. It's just to get an idea of where people are currently sitting in their thinking. So in terms of this streamlining effect, you can see here the version 2 sections on the left-hand side, 11 sections in the chain of custody standard, number of requirements, tens of pages of our standard, and the mapping between that and our version 3 sections, which, as I mentioned before, are really focused on the material accounting systems under study. We've significantly streamlined the management systems that need to be in place. We've streamlined the articulation of outsourcing contractors in order to make that much simpler to implement, but also to audit. But the rules don't change. Essentially, for outsourcing contractors, the risk lies with the certifying entity, right? So the outsourcing contractors essentially are under the umbrella of the entity itself. The scope of the chain of custody before that really looked at ASI material bottom up by supply chain activity. It said, well, if you're shipping ASI bauxite, this is what you've got to do. If you're shipping ASI alumina, you have to do ASI bauxite in, ASI alumina out, and you might be integrated, so it might be aluminium out. That got quite complicated because you have different materials flowing through the system with different yields. And sometimes you might be shipping 50% of your output as alumina, the rest retained for aluminium. Got difficult with scrap when you see different yields in place there. So that scope and also the sourcing of ASI material sections, instead of being focused on ASI bauxite, ASI alumina, ASI aluminium, eligible scrap, we treat that as a singularity. It's ASI material. And the rules for ASI material are the same, whether you're shipping bauxite, alumina, aluminium, input of scrap, etc., etc. Those underlying rules and the accounting systems are the same. They always were, but it got a bit confusing in the previous standard where you had those rules embedded under each material type. Now it's a singular approach across all ASI materials. Supply due diligence is out. We've taken that out. That belongs in the performance standard. This is this duplicative criterion that, you know, you get conflicts when it's in two places at once. So it's out of the chain of custody standard, but it retained in the performance standard. The same with claims. Any kind of duplicative claims sections out, and claims is really handled in the claims guide. For the CoC standard, it's about material accounting and then linking that to the claims that may be made elsewhere. So talking about some of these rules, as I mentioned, no change to the material accounting period rules. It's a maximum of 12 months reconciliation. No change to rules for outsourcing contractors, retained, but clarified. There's a slight change to the minimum requirements for ASI material identification data, and that's to say that rather than being attached to CoC documents per se, physical documents, it's the data that passes between entities that's most important, and there are minimum elements of that. I don't think that materially that changes things in terms of the effort required, but there is a slight change in some of those data points. So do go and review those and give us your feedback on that shift as well. One change, which I think is a change, which is important to note here, is that previously positive balances could be carried forward, but essentially had to be used up in the following year or the following accounting period, sorry. But then in that following accounting period, you could just generate another positive balance. And given that this is mass balance and you're not physically tracing that material, you're just balancing it in a database. What that meant in practice is that the positive balance could be retained indefinitely. You just draw down and pump it up in the following year. In this new version, and really do want your feedback on this, we say, actually, no, you can't do that. You can generate a positive balance, but once you've done that, you can't do it for the next 2 years. You can draw that positive balance down, but you can only carry forward positive balances a maximum of once every 3 material accounting periods. That's to avoid this rolling mass balance. Really welcome your feedback on that. Don't like it, let us know. Do like it, let us know. A key focus of the consultation are these different options for mass balance. And I'm conscious of time here, and I can see some questions. So why don't I go to some questions first, and then I'll carry on with this. How are we working to increase the demand for chain of custody ASI material? Currently see entities certifying it's the standard, but with limited business tangible outcomes due to low CoC demand flow. Actually, this is an interesting one. There is a question in the survey. I'm not sure you can see it here, but there is a question in the survey, in SurveyMonkey, which says, do you support some kind of mechanism outside of the standard that is a requirement, let's say, or a requirement of membership for downstream entities that aren't necessarily chain of custody certified to make some kind of demand of responsibly sourced material, which may include ASI Aluminium, it may not. So have a look at that question. That's specifically designed for this, is to say, is there something we can do outside of the standard to really increase this demand from ASI members who are committed to ASI's approach, but who may not be part of the CoC system? So that question, Freya, is one for you. Go onto SurveyMonkey and have a look at that and give us the feedback on that. We have to be careful, of course, with antitrust and market manipulation rules, but within that, within those boundaries, we are exploring how we can get this pull of material. So we've done quite well, because I have to say that of the bauxite mines currently, globally, there's about a 30% volume of bauxite that is ASI certified. It then, of course, erodes as it goes through the system. Doesn't quite, it's not anywhere near that when you get to final products. Question again from Freya, is ASI considering low carbon product claims in relation to traceability? This chain of custody standard is about a singular quality ASI material. We are working on some carbon footprint, or we're exploring carbon footprint approaches. It doesn't sit within chain of custody. And if we were to go down a product carbon footprint route, you couldn't do it at entity level mass balance, which is what we currently have. You have to have something much more granular. And that leads me into this next section, which is, do we want to make chain of custody a bit more granular? You'll see in SurveyMonkey's survey 3 options, which we really, really want to hear from you about how we might evolve the chain of custody standard and the mass balance approach. One is to keep our current entity level mass balance approach. The second is an entity level mass balance approach, so inputs and outputs balanced across the whole of the certification scope, with a site level minimum sourcing of ASI material. This was certainly supported by some of our downstream entities. And then finally, an option which is a transition to site level mass balance, so inputs and outputs have to be balanced at the site level, even if the entity is broader than that, but with a 5-year period or some kind of transition period, because that's quite a significant shift in the model. In fact, I'm going to put up the poll now. You can enter your answers here at your leisure, but essentially that asks the question that is also in SurveyMonkey: which of these options looks to you like an appropriate one to evolve ASI's model? And under that option 2, if we do have minimum sourcing, what kind of level does that minimum sourcing look like? Maybe just a kind of quick visual example of a question coming on due. I'm going to leave that one to the end. We do have a question coming. I'm going to answer that live if we get some time. So currently, our entity level mass balance model says that the certification scope is the boundary for material accounting as well. And you can see here this inputs balanced with an output, and a claim that could be made for ASI allocated output material from a site which has never really seen any ASI material input. But of course, balanced across the entity, that's perfectly valid. That's our current system. Under an option 2, you'd maintain this entity level mass balance, and remember before I said that not all entities are shipping material. For those that were shipping material, sites that ship material, you'd have to have a site level minimum ASI input as a share of your output. So here you can see an example of broader entity with 2 sites, one of which has less than 10% ASI output as ASI input, which cannot sell that material forward as ASI material, another with greater than 10%. In order to do that, you have to have some kind of site level material accounting for those sites that are supplying ASI material. So it's kind of a midway point between entity and site level. The final is this option, is this true site level material accounting. Again, you could have a larger entity. So you're not talking about multiple certificates or multiple audits. You could have one audit across the whole entity, but the material accounting and inputs and outputs would be at that site level for all sites within the ASI system. As I say, that will require significant shift, but that's why we have a transition period. I can see already some of the answers that are coming in that tendency towards site level is actually, for you guys at least, is being expressed as the favoured one, although I would note that there is a range of opinions, it's not clear cut on that. What do those mean? Well, if you look in the drafts themselves, you can see that through some of the choices of those options, and what we expect to do is to choose one of those and proceed with that for the new version of the standards. So we will pick one and move with it. It would have implications for the requirements, but not a huge change. So let's say you go for option 3, it doesn't mean that you have 25 new requirements. It means that there are some slight shifts in the requirements for site versus entity level. Take a look at that. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but take a look at the drafts to see what the implications of those choices are for requirement application. Maybe before we go to some questions, is to say that all of what we've just articulated is in the SurveyMonkey survey. So we really do need you to give your opinions on those various options and to give your written feedback too. So please, please, please do go and take a look at those surveys and give that feedback as well. But I really want to make some time for questions. We've only got 10 minutes because I've talked too much. So I'm going to go over to the Q&A box now to see one. We have a comment only for option 3. The definition of what is a site is crucial for this criterion. Absolutely. Absolutely. Go and take a look in the draft. We have a definition of site that is articulated there. It could still do with some massaging, right? Because what we have there is geographically co-located process, etc., etc. Well, what if you have a smelter with, I don't know, a rolling mill that takes all of the smelter's output as slab, the smelter cast house as slab, but the rolling mill, it's about 20 kilometers away, but it has the same management system, it has the same ownership, ostensibly it's the same site, it's just geographically not co-located, but the systems and the controls are all right. Is that a site? Is it not a site? Take a look at our current definition and give us feedback on whether you see it as being one or the other. As I say, this is a draft for consultation, so your feedback is really crucial here. I've got a question. Could you give a practical example of what good due diligence looks like for a downstream smelter in relation to upstream risks like tailings or mine closure? Maybe, Marika, I can ask you to take that one. And I'm taking by downstream smelter, it's the primary smelter that's being referenced here.
Yeah, well, thanks, Chris. I think maybe not a bit of a boring answer, but I think it's very important to note that due diligence is a process that is ongoing. It's proactive. It's also reactive. You need to be able to respond promptly to risks, etc. It's risk-based, so it depends on what kind of the severity and likelihood of the risk that you find in your supply chain. And importantly, the nature and the extent of due diligence is appropriate. That is appropriate will depend on individual circumstances, like, of course, the size, the location, the situation, the sector, etc. So it's quite hard. We cannot give a textbook answer on what is a good example of due diligence. It's really, like I said, it is a kind of a process that is ongoing. And also improving over time. So initially, companies may have a lower understanding of the risks in their supply chain, But of course, as more companies and more entities are carrying out due diligence, and this is particularly, I guess, for the aluminium value chain, because this due diligence is fairly new to this compared to other supply chains, like for example, for gold or 3Ts. More information is becoming available, and companies are gathering that information. So therefore, that will help you with your carrying out your due diligence and understanding these risks in your supply chain. Yeah, that would be my answer to that question is yeah, it really depends, and the size and the nature and extent of the due depends on various circumstances.
And what that says, and you know, our system, this is built on the supplement to the OECD, says that smelter cast house smelter itself is that choke point. So
Yes.
up to the smelter, you have this kind of management of the risks through a due diligence process back to the mine site, and then post smelter, it's the same back to the smelter, with an understanding that the smelter then cascades that backwards. But what that does say, and this is maybe a misunderstanding here, is because that due diligence is a ongoing process, and ASI performance standard measures conformance with following that process. What the performance standard doesn't do, and thus what the chain of custody can't do as it passes along the chain, is to say, oh, all your risks are managed, so as long as you're sourcing ASI material, you're okay. You know, you've met X, Y, and Z requirement. No, actually, there's a due diligence expectation at every step in the chain. And in the new version of the performance standard, which says not only do you have to understand what's upstream, there's also a requirement or a responsibility for those smelters to pass information down the chain too.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Yes.
that was the heart of some of these questions. Very interesting. Great to get these questions as well. I don't know if people can see the poll that I've launched, but let me just say that we're now option 1, 2, and 3. Obviously, options 1 has now woken up a little bit. We have 15 responses, and 5 like option 1, 5 like option 2, and 5 like option 3. So that's interesting. How we come to a negotiated outcome on that is going to be challenging, but that's why we really do need your input through this consultation. The second question that's in there says, well, if you choose option 2, that minimum sourcing requirement, what kind of percentage are you looking for input and output? And we gave a couple of options: 10%, 50%, 100%, and other. And interestingly, there's quite a 10% seems to be where people are heading. I think there's 7 of 15 responses saying 10%. It's this signal that there must be some kind of linkage at site level, but understanding that liquidity and the structure of the industry is such that 10% sends a signal, but if you made it much more than that, it would constrain the flow of ASI material. And what we talked about earlier on, Freya's question, was about how do you encourage this material and risk management to flow through the system. There is a response that says 100%. So someone does like 100%. Is you give your feedback through the survey and elsewhere, I'd like people to articulate how they see 100% minimum sourcing as different from a site level mass balance approach. Or maybe it's not. Maybe it's a site level that people are looking for. So that's just something to bear in mind. If there's 100% of your output of ASI material at site level that is required at input, that essentially is a site level system for those who are sourcing and selling ASI material, albeit, as I said before, there's a large proportion of CoC certified entities that are not shipping ASI material. They're just getting certified against the standard. So with that, I think we only have a couple of minutes left. So maybe, Marika, I can ask if we have no more questions coming in. I could just ask you just in 1 minute to give your final thought, let's say, on responsible sourcing and due diligence as part of this process, and maybe a request for those who are currently online as well. And then I'll do the same for CoC.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, no, well, I think it's thank you very much for the questions that we received. Hopefully, this has given you some light on the new draft requirements for the responsible sourcing and due diligence sections. and that they apply. I think it's important to reiterate, perhaps Section 3 really reiterates to due diligence in the company's supply chain and the risks related to that, so including environmental, human rights, labor rights, etc., risks in the supply chain. And then for the company's own operations, due diligence, human rights due diligence, and is covered. Human rights due diligence is covered in 1.3 and 2.4, and of course for the company's due diligence as the environmental due diligence is covered under the thematic area. So I think that's just something that maybe is not always that clear, but I just wanted to reiterate that at the end of this section. And of course, we welcome your feedback. So please do go to our consultation hub and fill out the survey, or look at the Excel, or otherwise send us an email. We're very happy to answer your questions during this public consultation time. So thank you.
Thanks,
And very
Marika.
much for your participation. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all. Just on the CoC side, as you can see, a variety of positions. So I do want to hear all of those through the public consultation. This CoC, obviously, depending on where you are in the value chain, whether you're a certifying entity or those consuming ASI material, may have different positions. We want to hear about that. So please do, as Marika said, use the consultation inputs here. And in particular on CoC, I would like to hear about the streamlining impact and whether you think we've gone too far, or whether that is something that has made the CoC standard more valuable for you as a certifying entity. Your thoughts on the different options required, or the different options being offered for the evolution of the mass balance, and why that might be of value to you, your customers, and your suppliers. And thirdly, and to Freya's point in there as well earlier on, how do we not just ensure that management systems for ASI material are following the rules, but also that there is a market for ASI material that is pulling some of this aluminium through the value chain, and how can ASI help to build those demand signals for ASI material and thus implementation of the performance standard. With that, and only a minute over, thank you all very much for your participation, for your questions as well. And we're all available at the Secretariat should you have any follow-up questions. I'll see some of you next week for a climate webinar, I think next Thursday. Get on the hub to book your place there. With that, thank you all very much. Thank you, Marika.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.